Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today will be content-wise a little bit different than what I'd normally dip into, but I got given this gigantic omnibus called Marvel Masters of Suspense that's a collection of mostly Stan Lee and Steve Ditko collaborations. I believe most, if not all of these, are Doctor Strange and pre-Spider-Man, and a lot of them are for sure also pre-Marvel, actually being called Marvel. This was given to me by student Tony Hines. Thanks, Tony. Shout out to Tony. Tony was in my art appreciation class recently. He was a comics dealer. Of course, we got along great, talked about comics all the time. And he had an extra copy of this, or someone gave it to him and he didn't want it, so he passed it along to me. And I'm really grateful for it. It gave me a chance to look at some stuff that I never would have looked at otherwise. So these are all pretty short, like 4-page stories, 8-page stories. They seem to be following along the line of a lot of the EC stuff where you have, just a short little horror story or short little sci-fi story with a twist at the end. These seem to be, I think, more morally charged than the EC stuff and the twists a lot of times. Not all of them are written by Stan Lee, but Stan Lee's kind of bringing his Stan Lee or Steve Ditko, whoever, are bringing like this kind of a more positive ethic to it, where I think a lot of the EC stuff is just shock value. The other thing that I appreciated relative to the EC stuff that I've been reading, or at least the Feldstein written stuff, is that there's not so much captions overly explaining things. A lot of it's dialogue based, and there's less exposition. You can have a little short 4-page story all in one. So I think that's really cool. As I got into the book more, though, it was like the story's just not my kind of thing. As a kid, this would all be really cool, but this is a big book, and at 4 pages a time, there's a ton of stories in here. So reading material wise, not exactly my thing, but it is really fun to go back and look at Ditko's work. Yeah, so a lot of the notes I made were just going through noting things in the images. I'm more of a futurist in terms of the medium. I'm more concerned about what's going on today and what could be going on tomorrow than what's gone on in the past. I know people probably get a false impression of my interest because I worked on Strange Death with Dave Sim, but that was his historical research project. I was just doing the drawing on it. So I'm not a great historian. A lot of what I'm looking at here is just based on what I do know, and a lot of what interests me in this book, and a lot of what interests me always in looking at older works, is trying to figure out who they've since influenced, but also with my limited knowledge, kind of paying attention to who maybe led to this. Of course, from working on Strange Death, I'm more familiar with the lineage of the photorealists, and so coming into this work, like, I can see some of that. I can see, the like, this kind of stuff looks very Wally Wood to me, which is obviously coming out of Alex Raymond, which you see in some of the science fiction stuff. And there's like some Hal Foster and those kind of things in here. And that's maybe one of the things that interests me most in this book, is I'm starting to see why Ditko is so important. I think most of the people who watch this channel probably know better than me, but he kind of seems like a funnel point for a lot of the more realistic stuff, and then like coming back out to more stylized stuff. And I see a ton of people that he must have influenced going forwards. And like this panel here to me looks really, really like a Dave Gibbons drawing. Also, I see some very like Dan Clowes type of things going on in there. But yeah, looking at this, I can see Dave Gibbons having really studied this. And there's a lot of instances in here where it seems like certain artists must have really been like, man, I love that panel, man, I love the techniques that he's using in that panel, but like, I'm not necessarily seeing it in this panel. Also, who knows with the reproduction of these? I know some of these, they actually have the art entirely redrawn because the sources aren't very good. So you never know when the person doing the restoration is actually picking up on some of those things. I don't know enough about these to know for sure, but that was my main interest in going through this. Also, really cool to see that these were being published through Atlas pre-Marvel, and seeing them have like a tale to marvel at with kind of the big block lettering that we're still familiar with from Marvel. So seeing that kind of seeding itself in the book was interesting to me. This especially this panel right here is where I see a lot of like, my guess here is what was going on is Ditko would have been seeing Foster, Raymond, Leonard Starr. Like I see a lot of Leonard Starr in some of these more cartoony type of things. This looks like the kind of the Foster Raymond mix to me. Also thinking about that he was an artist that was probably seeing these guys as they were reproduced rather than seeing them in originals. So some of the simpler lines, the fatter lines, the use of thicker lines, things like that would have been an artist that was being visually trained on materials that were poorly reproduced. I know a lot of my own stylistic tics when I was a kid were based on how comics looked in reproduction. So there's like a simplification and like a stylization and cartooning thing that seems to be going through the filter of those guys with the poor reproduction, and then coming out like, again, I see in this, I see a lot of Dave Gibbons or Brian Boland, a lot of what I associate with artists in the British scene in some of this early Ditko stuff, a lot of this sci-fi stuff as well. Also, I don't know about when Jack Kirby and Ditko were working, who was drawing in what style, when, but some of the more fantastical sci-fi stuff in my memory of early Kirby work versus what we've come to think of, like Kirby when he's at Marvel, you know, with not like early Captain American stuff, but coming back when Marvel was properly Marvel. It's you kind of wonder what the influence there was back and forth. And again, I'm sure this has been covered plenty by other people. It's also interesting to note that in the beginning, the first few of these, like you have the standard stretched out Ditko face, but they're not so strange yet. And even while I was reading this, like Tori was looking over my shoulder and seeing some of these faces and being like, man, that guy draws really long faces. And then I got to some of these, I'm like, yeah, look how weird these are. So some of these like just really interesting distorted faces, I can see why he would have been the perfect guy to be doing Spider-Man, be doing Doctor Strange, setting up those weirder looks where you want things to seem stranger and creepier. And I can also see why, you know, Ditko had such an impact that he did with these books coming out because of the stylization, because of the strangeness. He must have been a really identifiable and singular vision compared to the other stuff going on. But again, I'll admit my ignorance. This could have been a very standard style. I don't know. Also, very interesting to notice this proto Osborne hair, where here it makes sense as someone who has kind of curly hair and they've greased it up and slicked it back. Like you can see the rolling slicks of hair there and there, and seeing how that later probably became like the standard Osborne hair is interesting, where no one knows what the hell it is, but really probably what it was with the guy with wavy hair who's greasing it back, and it's became this weird like sausage thing that it is today. Also really interested seeing, really the only Ditko stuff I've read prior to this is some of his Mr. A work, which I find strange and compelling for its strangeness. But seeing kind of this thing here where it looks almost like he has the weights of justice pointing on his head, and then you have section A and B. Who knows? That could just be me mapping stuff onto it, but pretty interesting to see that panel as well. And then when I'm going through like looking, you know, like I said, I read maybe about this much of it, and then I couldn't bear to waste my time on the stories anymore, so I just started looking at the art. But even then, you know, just looking at some of what's going on with the layouts, dropping the panels, breaking this up with the lettering right here to almost create two different panels, and the flow between here. I think there's just some interesting stuff going on. The symbolic nature of things that I associate with Ditko in the Mr. A stuff here, like having the question mark on the guy's face, like we don't know what that is. Those all seem interesting. I don't know how innovative that was at the time, but given how well he's regarded, I'm assuming that was all seen as very innovative stuff at the time. Here's another one that maybe I'm just overthinking things, but I noticed that this character's hand looks like he's holding a staff or a post or something, and just like taking the time to line it up with the gutter here and creating this like imaginary tangent, that stood out to me as kind of an interesting compositional trick. Maybe it was entirely accidental, but it looks pretty purposeful to me. So stuff like that's really cool. And then just the machinery. This is one of the things where I wonder, was Ditko doing this kind of machinery and that influenced Kirby, or was Kirby doing this and it influenced Ditko? Which way did that influence go? That would be something, since I know a lot of people in the audience are gonna just be shaking their heads at how little I know about this. Instead of scolding me, please just inform me. Like, which way did the influence go? I don't know. Like I said, I'm more of a future forward guy instead of a historian. This was one of the last stories I read, and I did kind of have to crack up at this story. Uh, this is about a genie who has trapped. Instead of being trapped in the bottle, he was trapped in the bottle, and then spreading these stories that you could get the genie to be your slave if you rub them out of the bottle. But really, he was just doing that to escape. And then he came out and wound up having allergies. And as someone who suffers from allergies myself, this story made me laugh pretty good to see this genie come out, and just no matter where he teleports himself to in the world, he's still got awful allergies, and so eventually he just wants to go back into his little gold lamp there and enjoy the safety. And I often feel like that. I often joke with Tori that I want to be locked in a bunker somewhere, like with just all the modern amenities, but out in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, just my little bunker house. And so I feel you, Mr. Genie. I feel you. This image here, and this story in general, actually, where you have this Sphinx. Obviously, Ditko's got some references on that because it's like more realistically rendered in places. But some of the way he's using line work here, I see as like a really proto, like Neil Adams must have been looking at this. The way there's some really really thick lines, and then a lot of the tricks that Ditko does with like the parallel hatching, going from these really, really thick marks to having some thinner marks, these more like chaotic edges where it's not so perfectly feathered out. It's a little bit scratchier looking, but particularly like this right here, where there's all these big thick lines, and then you have the one thin line, seems like a very Neil Adams thing. It seems pretty likely to me that as Adams was coming out of the photorealist strips and starting to try and combine like the energy of Kirby, that Ditko would have been a good touch point for him, how to get something a little bit more naturalistic looking. Like, I think you take that leg in general and it's a pretty good naturalistic look within that style. So that's one of the influences I saw quite a bit in here. I also see Ditko starting to play a lot with texture more, like having these dashed marks here on this guy made out of stone, and another character that looks like he's made out of sand fighting. Some of those thicker, brushier marks combined with the smaller marks seems again like something that Neil Adams picked up on, and then through, I'm sure, a study of Ditko, but also Adams passed on into Frank Miller. Like something about this right here. I know I've seen this image before. I think this is probably an artist edition, or I don't know, this is probably just a famous image, but something about this, something about the way that the hatching's done throughout here, again, seems to have that lineage of Neil Adams into Frank Miller. It's hard for me to imagine that these guys weren't kind of obsessively studying Ditko or big fans of Ditko. Again, the really fun, like just designs, really abstract, paying attention to shape, coming out of like modern sculpture, I think would have been where the influence was. I don't know, but it looks like modernist sculpture to me. Those things were catching my eye as very intriguing, and I again imagine that that must have been part of why he is regarded the way he is. This is another one here that to me just sings like Frank Miller. It also, again, I feel like this is an angle that Dave Gibbons would use. It feels kind of like the hands Dave Gibbons would use, but also like a Frank Miller type of positioning. Also, the way that the tone is put over this, the type of hatching that's throughout here, feels like early Frank Miller to me. And again, some like Neil Adams, some of the frame. This feels also like that Neil Adams more exaggerated but realistic. It seems like that must have been a touch point for both of those artists quite a bit. This drawing they had singularly as a splash earlier in the book, and it really surprised me. Like, I tend to think of Ditko as the more simple stuff like this, the more stripped cartoony stuff, just based on, looking at old Spider-Mans and Doctor Stranges like that. I'm not used to seeing him do so much cross-hatching and rendering. Also, the Mr. A stuff has much more simplified. So really surprised to find ones like this that almost make me think of, like, I wanted to at first say Barry Windsor Smith working on Adam, the Solar Man of Solar Power, whatever that's called, from Valiant. But then I was thinking also Bob Layton, I think, was the guy that was actually drawing those. Again, that's stuff that was coming out when I was a kid, but I wasn't watching too much of it. But this just really surprised me when I saw it. It just didn't seem like what I associate with Ditko. So seeing, yeah, like some of the way the cross hatching works here seems Barry Windsor Smithy to me. Something about the proportions of the body, the way the arms are drawn, just I called to me like a lot of the art that I associate with the Valiant era comics, Jim Shooter. So that must be another set of people he influenced. And again, the way the hatching works throughout here seems like something that I associate a lot with British artists. So that's interesting. And then the monster designs, seeing these as just a design influence, I think that reminds me a lot of early Gilbert Hernandez and some of the more recent stuff where he's going back to drawing monsters. Not all of the hatching and necessarily the texture work, but the kind of silly designs on these things. So that must be an influence that came out of this. I would speculate, just based on how it looks. That's all interesting to me. Then this character definitely has that proto Mr. A feel. You start to see as this book goes longer that the art goes back to the more simplified stuff, the big juicy line work, the big juicy brushwork without so much of the pen work going throughout it. That's more like my limited understanding of Ditko, what I associated with him. And it seems that as he goes, these were maybe getting pumped out faster, or he was working on more things because he was more popular. I'm not sure. But then every now and then you'll get one of these things that's much more realistic, but still like exaggerated and distorted and strange and cartoony. And then again, I start to see those Neil Adam, Frank Miller type of vibes going on in images like that. I could also see like that lineage going, Bill Sienkiewicz, like early Bill Sienkiewicz stuff looking like that. So a really interesting, yeah, he's like this funnel figure, I guess, at least in how I'm viewing it. And I'm sure other people have written about this and talked about it way more extensively. Here's some of those Brian Boland super thin lines. So I very much feel when I'm looking at this like there wasn't people coming out doing like the Steve Ditko thing. They were like different artists were finding different panels. Like this one here feels very much like an old illustration. He seems kind of flexible in his approach. I don't see anything in here acknowledging any inkers, so I don't know if it's an inker by inker thing, but it's all signed S. Ditko. So my guess is because they're acknowledging the letterers and the writers, I'm assuming that he was inking his own stuff. So seeing that versatility is also really interesting. I had to laugh by the time we get to Tales of Suspense number 22 here, that all of a sudden you've got Stan Lee's signature on these things too, even though he obviously wouldn't have been involved in any of the art. Stan felt like he needed to put his name on it. So that we have to laugh at that and kind of cringe in that in retrospect. But yeah, as the book goes on, it starts going back to a little bit simpler approach overall, I think. Also, they really had to just laugh at this monster. To me, it looks like a monster doing drag, like overdoing the lip makeup and overdoing the eyeshadow. But it does make it, it's not supposed to be a scary monster. It's supposed to be a sympathetic monster. So that one cracked me up quite a bit. This one also, like the pacing and staggering of this story was pretty interesting to me. This more moment by moment or zooms. This seems strange compared to the other work that's much more bombastic. and again has more of that Dave Gibbons, a 9-panel grid pacing, that it feels more familiar, it feels more 80s to me. So that's what I'm taking away from this, is just the impact going forward that he had that I just wasn't really aware of. Then they have this nice little like artist edition thing in the back where they've got some reproductions of original art, which is really nice because, like I said, it's hard to know what exactly is being reproduced here. The line quality and everything suggests that they had original art resources. There doesn't look like a lot of areas where there's fill in, which is strange given the material they must have been working with, because I know a lot of this original art's just missing, and I have heard plenty about these things being redrawn, so I don't know how much of those are actually based on the original art. But it is really nice to see some of the original art in black and white. And I think a lot of my distaste for early comics as a kid had to do with the coloring, the flatness of the coloring. When I see these things in black and white, they're just so much richer, and I feel like these artists are really good because I can see the design components of what they were doing. Some of that's the reproduction too. Like when I saw this stuff as a kid, it just seemed, this looks like bad art to me still, but I'm sure if I saw black and white of the original, it would look like a better drawing. There was also one I had tagged in here. I must have not. I must have not tagged it. I thought I tagged one, but there was like one panel. Like this one's kind of an example where I really feel like I saw. Oh, that's the one that Charles Burns obsessed over, and that's a lot of how I felt about the art in this book. Is like, oh, these are the Steve Ditko panels that this artist was obsessing over, but then this artist was obsessing over something else. And any artist that can kind of spawn many different veins coming out of them is really interesting. So yeah, that's my biggest takeaway, is him as the funnel between a lot of different things and to a lot of different things. Also really enjoyed right here at the end these couple covers or pinups that were done for Monster Menace that get a little bit meta. This seems to kind of prophesy where he would go with some of the more fun experimental layouts in the Mr. A material, where the letters become part of the images, the symbols become part of the images. I think that one's really fun. And then, given that I had just noted Stan Lee feeling like he needs to slap his signature on Steve Ditko's artwork, there's this one here where there's like a bottle of ink being thrown at the editor's office, and the editor saying, I asked Ditko if he'd like to comment on his early monster work. I'm expecting something soon. And it's basically like a screw you, it looks like. So you can see that, like, what we all know now is a pretty strained relationship, and that idea of kind of the crazy old crank that hides in his apartment that no one, like won't talk to anyone and is just doing this strange Ayn Randian thing that Ditko became. It's kind of fun to see those, but I also think those are just really fun designs as well, fun compositions. So really enjoyed browsing through this book. Like I said, this is not something for me to read, but I do wish that there were complete collections like this just of artists' work to go back. And even if I don't want to read the stories, there are certain artists like Ditko that I think it would be really beneficial to just have a Ditko library, just assemble everything and get it in reproduction, just for historical purpose, for the pleasure of looking at the art, rather than doing characters or series or things like that. I think there would be great benefit to the medium, to the history of the medium, to assemble creator libraries. I know there's probably not much incentive for the publishers to do that, so we'll just take these omnibuy as we get them and be grateful for them. So again, thank you, Tony, very much. This was very educational. Apologies to everyone who knows way more about this stuff than me, that I've probably butchered the understanding of the history, but I would like to know more, and you all filling me in the comments would be a great way to do that. Please just be kind to me. The Eisner nominated The Strange Death of Alex Raymond by Dave Sim and myself. This is a gorgeously illustrated and designed book, Dave doing most of the illustration. Amazing compositions throughout. What Dave is doing is he's recording his obsession with the death of master cartoonist Alex Raymond behind the wheel of Stan Drake's car when they got into car crash. The best description of the book that I've heard is that it's like understanding comics with pages like this, mixed with something like From Hell, when you get into the theories about what actually happened with the car crash. And then with Sean on production, it's just one of the most gorgeously printed books you could get a hold of.